Awesome. Thanks so much, Colin. So welcome, everyone. It's really nice to be here. It's lovely to have a chance to be part of this conversation. And I think this is going to be just that, a conversation. As Colin said, and you probably heard coming in, Moshe and I will be chatting about his book and about mediation and the connection between those two things. And it's going to be fascinating. And then we'll open it up for a conversation with everyone. But the reality is it's all just going to be a conversation. So as Colin said, throw stuff in the chat. Honestly, if you want to just jump in while Moshe and I are talking, both of us would welcome that. The more sort of interaction, the better. So feel free. We'll generally shoot for a half hour of conversation, and then a half between Moshe and I, and then a half hour of conversation with all of us. But if you want to flip the order and just jump in, please do. The other thing I wanted to just say before we start is that this is a really exciting group to have this conversation with, because you all have a deep experience in the mediation space, which is something Moshe is deeply committed to, and I know drove us heavily on in his work that shows up in Collywobbles, which is focused on negotiation. And so I think it will be really exciting for you to be thinking about how have you used the kinds of techniques and strategies Moshe talks about, and where could you imagine using them in your work as mediator, so that let's really bring this conversation into that sort of interweave, which leads maybe, Moshe, to my first question, which is, you've written this book from Collywobbles from the lens of the negotiator. And you open the book by saying that the thing you've observed through doing a lot of negotiation support, mediation, coaching, et cetera, is that the place we all trip up is actually, for many of us, with ourselves, right? It is the internal that gets in our way, not that we didn't know the right theory. And so I'd be interested to hear you talk a little more about how is that the conclusion that you're starting from as a place? And then I want to move into taking that insight and applying it to mediation. But let's start with that first question of like, why start there? Why start with the struggle of ourselves and then think about how that connects to mediation?
All right, well, thank you, Justin. And it might be helpful to give just a tiny little bit of background about how I came to be doing what I'm doing, because I think that informs that decision. So I started off in physics and engineering, and I worked in engineering for about 13 years, decided to transition into management, went to business school. And when I was in business school, I took a negotiation class, and it had 1 week on mediation, and I got to play the mediator in a role play, and I fell in love. And as a result of that, I got some, the basic mediation training, started mediating back in '95. And then very quickly discovered that mediation on its own was a very difficult way to make a living. So I started adding things to it. For me, one of the natural things to add was teaching. So I started teaching mediation, and then eventually mostly negotiation in companies. And then in 2000, Boston University invited me back in. So since 2000, I've been teaching in the MBA program at BU and teaching negotiation, leadership, organizational behavior, but mostly I'm known there for negotiation. And what I've observed in teaching negotiation for all these couple of decades is that we teach people skills and strategies, and then they go to use them and they choke. Something gets in the way. Sometimes they get excited, sometimes they get nervous, sometimes they rush, sometimes they just freeze. And it wasn't that we're not teaching them good skills and strategies, but that something else was getting in the way. So over time, that became a real focus for me to try to understand what's getting in the way. Now, when I first became a mediator, one of my trainers defined mediation to me as facilitated negotiation. So if we're facilitating other people's negotiations, understanding what's going on for them as negotiators actually makes us better mediators. It helps us serve them more effectively. The other thing that we need to realize is that those same impacts that happen for the parties are actually happening for us as mediators. If we as mediators, for instance, are uncomfortable with loud or very vocal expressions of anger, that's going to be an emotional impact on us, and it might impede us from being as effective as mediators. So you're always looking at this in two dimensions. What is going on for the parties? And the better we can understand what's going on for them, the more effectively we can help them, but also what's going on for us as mediators. The reason I chose the title for the book, Collywobbles, if you don't know, means tummy ache. And specifically that tummy ache you get when you're anxious or fearful. And if you think about it, that's what happens a lot of times in the mediation room. People are uncomfortable getting there, and people are, they're not at their best. And the better we can understand that, the better we can do. So it was really just by observing my students, observing my corporate clients, and just saying, we're all doing such a great job teaching them, but something's getting in the way, and that's what we need to address.
And so if you think about that, Moshe, that you're starting to identify something's getting in the way. And the book is, in some sense, the articulation of what is that something. And I wonder if there's a couple of points as you think about the mediation context that feel most relevant, most important. That you imagine you're in a mediator role, you have parties, they're in conflict, and you're asking yourself, what of the somethings that's getting in the way for them is most important for me to be watching for me to be able to be a mediator who's doing more than just the sort of math problem of interests, options, to get to the human side of it. So what do you pull from what you've written in Collywobbles into your mediation practice that allows you to be a better neutral for the parties you work with?
So I would say three things in particular. First one is instantaneous emotional reactions, right? The way our mind works, anything that happens to us impacts us on the emotional level first, and emotions hit us very, very hard and very fast, and then they start subsiding before our cognitive brain can take over and start coming up with ideas of how to deal with the situation. If we can observe those instantaneous emotional reactions in the parties, we can help them slow down time so they can get back to a better version of themselves and be more responsive rather than reactive as they mediate. The same thing that happens to us. We need to observe our own instantaneous emotional reactions and then use that time to get ourselves to a better place. And that sometimes as a mediator, you need to call a mediator's break, not for the parties, but because you need to get yourself to a better space. So being aware of, I call that the emotional response curve, and that you're really, you have these emotional spikes, and then you need to give them time to attenuate. The second thing is narrative. In chapter 6, I talk a lot about what we tell ourselves as we negotiate, right? The chapter is called What's Your Story? We all tell ourselves all the things all the time. We tell ourselves stories about ourselves, about the other party, and about the situation. And those stories impact what we do, how we feel, and how we interact with another person. So in order to manage what we do, we need to understand our own narratives. And one of the things that we can do as mediators is, especially in private session, help parties understand their own narratives so they can be clear about what they're telling themselves. I gotta tell you, I also do a lot of negotiation coaching. And one of the questions I ask people a lot as I coach them is, what are you telling yourself right now about the situation? Or what are you telling yourself about the other person? There's another opportunity, of course, in joint session to help them illustrate their stories to each other and gain more understanding that way. But that's actually a separate thing. You can I think get a lot of benefit even in private session just from having people get more clarity on their own stories. And the third thing is that people negotiate very much out of fear. And we've all seen that as mediators. People come into the mediation room with just all sorts of fears. And you can break down fears into three major categories. One is fear of tangible hurt. I might be worse off because I'm here, or I might push too hard and get nothing. The other fear is fear of relationship damage. I'm mediating a workplace dispute with my boss. I might have a bad relationship with my boss if this doesn't go well. And the third one is a fear of emotional pain. I'm going to get rejected, or I'm not going to get what I was really hoping to get. And that pain, that emotional pain will then inhibit me from doing things in the future. Those fears are amplified by a number of stress factors. Conflict is a huge amplifier of these fears. Uncertainty is a huge amplifier of these fears. I don't know if you ever wondered why almost every kid in the world is afraid of the dark. It's because they can't see what's there, and what we can't see, we can imagine. And negotiations are inherently uncertain. I mean, we've all seen that look on the face of parties going into the mediation room very uncertain about what this is all about, what's going to happen, what will I have to do or say, what will I have to give up, what will the other party do? And that uncertainty amplifies whatever fears they bring into the room. And another big stress factor that impacts these fears is power perception. If someone in a mediation perceives themselves to be in a lower power position to the other side, then they feel like the other person is in a position to inflict tangible hurt, relationship damage, or emotional pain on them. Now, the more aware we are of these things, the more we can ask the parties open-ended questions, again, especially in private session, to help them discuss what fears are driving them in this negotiation. And very often, by the way, there's a correlation between the fears and the narratives. They have narratives that drive these fears, and by being able to talk about these things, they become more aware of them. You see, all of this comes from the basic understanding of emotional intelligence, and the cornerstone of emotional intelligence is self-awareness. And we can have conversations with the parties where we can help them become more self-aware, so then they can get to a point where they're making decisions that are more responsive, less reactive, and therefore more consistent with their interests.
And so I wonder, Moshe, as you talk about this, imagining myself or imagining one of us in a conversation with a party or in a private session, and we're asking them, what's important to you? What would success look like? Sort of standard issue interest identification questions. Maybe the best way to illustrate this would be through a story or something, but I'm trying to figure out that moment where you say, time to talk narrative and fear. And because I can see myself just autopiloting into interest to options. What are your alternative? Just kind of running the system. How do you decide when you're going to move to a conversation about narratives, when you think there's a fear of relationship damage and you need to address that? And then what does that actually look like? I mean, you talk about asking open-ended questions, but those seem like very different questions than the ones I might ask to identify interests. Talk about that.
So, I actually don't see that great a distinction, because I think very often when we define interests, we define them pretty narrowly. And this just broadens our perception of interests. People have tangible interests, but they also have intangible interests, emotional interests. They have interests that aren't even their interests. If they feel like they're representing some constituent, like their family, then they have their family's interests they have in mind. So if you broaden your concept of interest and understand that fear is an interest, right? A lot of times when we talk about what are interests, we say that they're the motivations, fears, and needs of the people that are in the room. Fear is a big part of that. So I don't think it's a separate conversation, right? In chapter 9, I talk about the listening triangle, right? This tool it's essentially a tool for drawing out the interests of the other party by asking them open-ended questions, staying silent, listening, hearing the interest, and reflecting back. And you just use the listening triangle very attentively, and you work with whatever they give you. It's not like I decide to go to narrative. If I hear a narrative, I reflect that narrative back, and I ask open-ended questions that will allow the party, if they want, to go further in that pursuit of narratives.
So that leads to a question around your own reaction, because I think maybe what's being highlighted and what I'm saying is my drive for closure, for productive conversation, et cetera. So they get off on some tangent about how the other person's a villain, and I'm like, okay, cool. But what are your interests, right? And so I wonder if you would talk about that, about how you think about following the parties, but also how do you negotiate with yourself? How do you manage your own internal desire to get this over with, deal with the person who's angry, you see the right, I mean, how do you manage that to be able? So why is it so important from your perspective, or how do you think about following the parties as so central to your approach to mediation? But then also, how do you get there?
Yeah. So great question. This is so much easier to help other people with than to do for yourself. It's one of those areas where it's tremendously helpful to have a co-mediator, because then on a mediator break, you can have a conversation and air out some of these things. If you don't have a co-mediator, and in many cases we don't, sometimes it's nice to have colleagues to talk about these things, not about a specific case, but more in general about your desire for closure. Look, we all have our own emotions that come into the room. We all have our own desires. I mean, if you are a mediator and your last 5 cases didn't resolve. In the 6th case, how badly do you want to finally have some resolution just for your own emotional satisfaction of reaching the end, right? It's not even that you are a closure-based mediator. You're just a human being, and it's natural to want that. So as with everything else, it starts with self-awareness. And you need to slow yourself down. Right? You need to be careful about what are you saying to the parties. You need to hear yourself. And if that means that you need to take a break and just reflect on what you're doing as a mediator, you do that because that's the time you need to take. But it's also very important for you to be thoughtful about your narratives. We develop narratives about the parties, right? You know, you hear the joint session, and in about 5 minutes, you've heard each party's story, and you immediately have a narrative about each of the parties. One of them's the victim, the other one's the villain, one of them's the nice person, the other one's the not so nice person. You have these narratives, and that's not a bad thing. That's just part of being human. It's bad if you're not aware of them. So as you take notes, jot down your narrative and circle it or mark it in some way as your narrative. Once you're aware of it, you can't be unaware of it anymore. So be aware of your narratives. If you feel like you want to do something in the mediation, let's say I want to press this party hard because I want to get them somewhere. If you can be aware of that, you can slow yourself down and ask yourself why. You know, we've all heard the phrase that in mediation, your purpose drives your practice. And I really, really believe that. But I also believe that we're not always honest with ourselves about what our purpose is. And that's kind of what you're getting at, Justin, right?
Yeah.
That our purpose is ostensibly to create a neutral process for the parties whereby they, if they choose, could come to an agreement that meets their interests. But that would be true if we were robots. As humans, we want this mediation to end soon because it's almost lunch and we're hungry. We want this mediation to end in an agreement because that makes us feel better. We want this party to be treated fairly because they're the nice party. We have our own emotions. We have our own stories that we bring into it. And none of that's bad, so long as we're aware of it and we're managing it, right? Having emotions is not a bad thing. Letting the emotions drive the bus, that can be the bad thing. And that happens if you're not aware. Right? So sorry, Justin, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, that gets in the book, you talk about the conflict styles, you know, collaboration, competition, accommodate, et cetera. But you overlay these really interesting alternative views on them. We often talk about conflict styles from the perspective of strategy. Is it more strategic to compete or accommodate or avoid in a given situation? But I think this piece you're talking about of what's driving us shows up there, where there may be other factors that might drive me out towards collaborate or accommodate. I wonder if you could speak to that and how also you've seen yourself or other mediators maybe use that well or badly.
So, you know, in the standard Thomas Kilmann model, which by the way is a model I really like and is just so prevalent, we say that people choose their negotiating style based on how much they care about the outcome versus the relationship. And that's often true in terms of our strategic choice. But if you look at what people do, very often they act very inconsistently with that. And the question is why? And my thinking is that there are other parameters that drive us that are more on the emotional level. And two that I isolated that really impact our negotiating style are, first of all, our time orientation. Emotionally, do I care about what's going on now? Or do I care about something longer term? See, because if I care about what's going on now, well, either I want to avoid this negotiation because what I want to be going on now is to be left alone, or I'm going to try to grab value and compete and get a lot for myself now, not thinking about the long-term repercussions. Whereas if I'm thinking longer term, maybe I'm worried about what's going to happen down the road because this is a workplace mediation. Well, then either I'm going to accommodate to give the other person what they want so they like me in the long term, or I'm going to try to create a lot of value for myself if the outcome is that important to me. The second variable that I bring in, which is interesting because it was an afterthought, but it became a main event now when I talk about negotiations, is your energy level. You see, both collaboration and competition require a lot of energy. And our energy level doesn't stay constant as we negotiate. Right? People come into a mediation with high energy, like, let me at them. Right? But you've seen this, right? We've mediated day-long mediations. People are really different in hour 1 and hour 7. Hour 1, they're like this. Hour 7, they're like, make it stop. I want to go home. And they start giving away everything just to get out of there. Now, some mediators use that as a coercive tool to drive agreement. I've seen mediators proverbially lock the door and keep the parties in there until the parties are exhausted. And we can debate whether that's ethical, because on one hand, we're helping the parties come to an agreement, and maybe that's good for the parties. On the other hand, that could be seen as quite coercive, and we might be bullying the parties into an agreement that is not so good for them. So, when mediators use that, we can talk about how ethical is that really. But it is a phenomenon that's going on both for the parties and the mediators. The parties will lose energy, and as they lose energy, they drift away from competing and collaborating down towards compromising and accommodating. Right? We as mediators also lose energy. And as we lose energy, our ability to manage our emotions go down. Our ability to be aware of what's going on and to respond appropriately, that goes down. And the implication of that is that if we feel our energy go down, we need to build in brakes into the process. If you keep going, but you're not effective, you're in a position where you might actually do some harm. And you need to monitor yourself so you don't do that. If you see that the parties are exhausted, take the parties into private session and ask them this really insightful mediator question. How you doing? Yeah, just check in with them. And if they say, I'm knackered, and you say, well, what do you want to do? Because they might say, well, let's keep going. And then you respect that and you keep going. If they say, I can't do this anymore, and you say, well, what are the choices if we don't continue now? And you mediate a process that will work for the parties. But part of our responsibility is watching both our energy level and the party's energy level. It's, I think, in my opinion, part of our ethical responsibility, but it's also what makes us good practitioners.
That connects to something you talk about later in the book, Moshe, where you talk about alternatives, thinking about alternatives, understanding alternatives, and also why people are so hesitant to do that, hesitant to walk to them, hesitant to think about them at all, certainly to bring them up. And I wonder how you, in the mediation context, you were talking about, low energy, high energy. Obviously, one of the things that determines my willingness to agree is how good I think my alternatives are and how willing I am to walk to them. And often, especially in mediations where court is the context, I have seen mediators use alternatives kind of, as you were saying, as a way to lock the proverbial door. So you're saying, what's your alternative? Go to the judge and see what they'll say? Good luck with that. There's some, you wouldn't say it like that, but then the narrative is you're better off with certainty than uncertainty. And I wonder how you think about that, in this sort of very follow the parties context. How would you think about bringing alternatives into the conversation? And also, what's the insight from the way we get stuck there from Collywobbles that helps you think about how to support parties in that conversation?
So a lot of this relates to power in the mediation or power in negotiations more generally. The thing that gives you the most power in any negotiation is not needing an agreement. Whoever needs the agreement less has more power. And at the same time, people have a very hard time conceiving of going to an alternative, and they're very reluctant to do it. In the book, I call it jumping out of the plane. Now, I've never actually done that, okay, because I've got a fear of heights, and going up and jumping from plane just doesn't seem sane to me. I've heard it's fun, but I haven't done it. But what I can imagine is that when you practice jumping out of the plane on the ground, it's a lot easier than jumping out of the plane when it's 10,000 feet in the air. Being able to go to alternatives, right? We always have alternatives. We can always go to them. But there's always costs and risks and fears involved So the question is, are we willing to go to them? As mediators, we need to be able to have conversations with parties about their alternatives. And I personally don't believe that going to the alternatives is always a bad thing. I mean, you remember that there many, many years ago, there was this bumper sticker everybody had that said, mediate, don't litigate. And I always thought, well, mediate when it makes sense and litigate where it makes sense, because each of these approaches is going to be appropriate at different times and better in terms of the party's interests at different times. And if we go in with a mediate, don't litigate approach, then we become parties and we become coercive in the process. So we need to be comfortable having conversations with parties around alternatives. Now, a lot of times people come into mediations with very unrealistic alternatives. That's why they're here. They each thought they had a 90% chance at trial. And from my physics days, I remember the probability stuff. That doesn't happen, right? No one can, they can't both have 90% chance of winning a trial. So a lot of what we do as mediators is ask them tough questions to help them develop a more realistic sense of their alternatives. And we can do that ethically. We can do that less ethically, right? We can use that as a club to essentially coerce them to thinking, oh, my alternatives are so scary, I have to come to an agreement. I don't like doing that. And I'm not going to judge anybody else who does that, but it's not my personal practice. But I do want to ask them really hard questions, because one of the biggest mistakes I've seen parties make is think they have great alternatives when they didn't, leave the mediation process and end up in a really bad spot. So I want the parties to make informed decisions, and I don't have any problem asking them really, really tough decisions. At the same time, parties, I remember many years ago, we had I was doing a mediation. It was a small claims mediation, and this guy was suing an insurance company relating to some sort of car accident. And he didn't have the greatest case in the world. But the insurance company was offering him even a worse amount. They offered him a very, very small amount of money. And I remember being with him in private session saying, what do you want to do? Here's the offer. And he said to me, if I go to court, I'm likely to lose and get nothing. But if I accept this offer, I will never be able to look myself in the mirror again. And I respect that, right? It's not maybe the decision I would have made, but he was super clear about his interests, and including his emotional interests. And it's his right, in my opinion, to go to those alternatives. So when it comes to alternatives, I think it's important for us to be open with the parties, to ask them hard questions, to not ourselves be fearful about talking about alternatives, but at the same time, to not go in with our own narrative that the alternatives are bad and our own agenda to keep the parties away from their alternatives.
So we're at the half-hour mark, and so I want to open up the conversation to Lucia.
Okay. A key thing that mediators can, and I think should do at the beginning of a mediation, look, the parties are there, you're in charge of the process. They kind of want you to be in charge of the process. So a lot of mediators are going through the ground rules and confidentiality and be tough on the problem, not on the people, all that stuff, no personal attacks. It's the icebreaker. The icebreaker serves two really important functions that feed into this conversation right now. One is that it helps the parties see each other as human beings. So my standard icebreaker is to say, we're going to each talk about something that we're passionate about, and it can be anything. And I always go first to demonstrate how to do it. And also it gives them time to think about the thing that they want to talk about. And this observes them in a relaxed state of mind. It helps them relax. It helps them see each other, not as the other party, but as a human being, calms the nerves, brings down that cortisol spiking, right? And for the mediator and for the parties too, if they're paying attention, you can observe the parties in their baseline behavior. That is them talking about something when they're in a more or less relaxed state of mind. then it helps you notice the changes from baseline later on. You might not know the meaning of the change from baseline, but at least you can notice it. So the icebreaker, even if it seems contrived, the parties will do it because you're in charge of the process. They'll do it.
You know, I agree with you in the sense that I think if you started a mediation by saying, all right, we will now all do a handstand, the parties would do it, right? They really do take a lot, and give us a lot of slack in terms of letting us, tell them what we're going to do. I haven't done the icebreaker thing before. I think it's a fascinating idea. One of the things that it does is it frames the negotiation between them as a conversation. And this is just a conversation between a bunch of people. And it also humanizes both you, the mediator, but them to each other. So it's a very nice idea. What it does is it puts everybody in a different emotional frame of mind. Having said that, I've seen things flip on a dime from a very nice conversation to finger pointing, accusations, yelling, going back to right where they were before, because there is the underlying dispute. And sometimes they almost can compartmentalize those two things in their mind. Yes, here's the person that I'm having a nice conversation with. All right, now I'm in fight mode. And so I'm sure it helps. It's a very interesting idea. And you have to be prepared for when they flip, that doesn't cause you to say, hey, what's wrong with you? We were just having a great conversation, because that's now you becoming emotional reactive to them not playing ball.
Yeah, spot on.
And the common thread there is this, I think both of you use the word of humanizing, right? That as mediators, we're sometimes described, again, as assisted negotiation, like we're negotiation mechanics, and we're going to get in there and figure out what's wrong with your negotiation, when really it's humans. And so what both of you are speaking to is the need and importance of having the, again, purpose drives practice. The purpose is, how do we create an effective conversation between humans? What's going to be required for that? So love that, Lucia. Thank you.
So
Others?
yeah, I do have a question for you. I mean, let's pretend you present that, and you've done 90 mediations where this has worked perfectly. Now you have these two parties, and you say, well, to start the process, I'd like each of us to talk about something that we feel passionate about. And I'll start. And one of the parties says, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, and I think that then you could just be transparent. You can reflect that back, that, oh, it seems like you're really resistant to do this. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, I think that's great. It's an opportunity, right? Everything that happens in the room is an opportunity to explore the party's interests.
In other words, get them talking more.
And that's great, unless there's a part of you that's thinking, you jerk. I just offered you something and you're not playing ball. And you need to manage your own emotional reaction so you can listen and reflect back and focus on the party's interests.
Right. And it really, I treat it as it's information. It's incoming information.
Yeah.
Love it.
Anybody else?
Yeah, no, please jump in. And then Ethan.
Thank you. So the way how you started the conversation came to me that you kind of talked about performative anxiety or being uncomfortable. And for me, performance is something that I'm genuinely interested in performative aspects of mediation. Now, on one hand, we have what we almost can compare to stage fright if you are not feeling comfortable with our performance. And another side of it is something what we like to call a confidence game. And these are kind of played against each other pretty much all the time. And what I am interested in is what's happening in between, which is how do we overcome our anxieties and fears when it comes to our performances. And that overcoming is going with the concept of courage, which essentially is a virtue. So we are introducing kind of a moral, ethical element into it. And those are the things which I don't want to lose the sight of, that whenever we are entering in our performative element, that at the same time, we are constantly facing and challenging ourselves. So this whole idea that we are kind of, in a way, overcoming all our deficiencies or inefficiencies, possibility of the failure and rejection, as you know, as you mentioned, and we are kind of moving through the whole process, and we are not working harder at, but we are working through the process. And that's where we are really meeting ourselves within this whole landscape of the mediation process itself.
So, you know, it's interesting. I've been mediating for a long time. I've mediated hundreds of cases. And yet every once in a while, I encounter parties that just make me anxious. Right? And I think that we all do. And I think you could think about what kind of people in the room might make you anxious. Sometimes it's certain personalities. Sometimes it's people with certain job titles. Sometimes it's people who have a certain level of knowledge. You know, if I had to mediate, let's say, between two experienced mediators, then I'd have this whole meta thinking of like, oh, they know everything I'm doing and they're analyzing what I'm doing as I'm doing it. I'd have this, and that's where you get into the performative aspects, where now I'm focused more on me and what I'm doing than on serving the parties, which is really what I'm there to do. So, you know, it's funny, I do a lot of public speaking and I coach a lot of my students in public speaking. And the first message I give them is, it's not about you. Make it about the parties. The more you focus on what's going on for the parties, why are they here? What are they trying to tell me? What can I hear behind their words? How I can help them make choices that are better from their point of view and help them get to wherever it is they need to get. I start becoming invisible. And the more I become invisible, the less the performative aspects matter. I have mediated people who know so much more than I do, but that's okay. The reason they're in mediation is because they weren't able to resolve something themselves and they're looking for help. And I have some skills and experience that might be able to help them. And by the way, if I end up not being the right person, maybe I wasn't the right person and somebody else can help them. But it's not about me. And if I keep my focus on them, I become less anxious because it's not about me.
Can I make a remark?
Please, please, it's a conversation. Say whatever you want.
Thank you. I'm very close to what you are saying, but for me, it is not a matter of priorities, meaning other people orientation versus self-orientation. There is, for me, a constant dynamic between both at the same time. In other words, I need to, the more I feel comfortable with my performative aspect, the more I can help these people. In other words, I cannot have the stage fright in certain way, because once I lose myself in my own anxieties, in that moment, I'm losing control over the process. So as I say, you know, there is something, this concept of challenging oneself goes hand in hand, being challenged by the situation or others who are part of the whole landscape of mediation. So I don't want to put, you know, myself into the center, and I don't want to prioritize the parties. I think the self-orientation and other orientation are as important as, you know, in a conjunction, as I would like to put it.
So in emotional intelligence terms, what I would say is self-awareness is critical, and that's where the self comes in, and self-management is critical, right? It's not enough that I'm aware that I'm anxious. It's what do I do about it? So for instance, let's pretend that my mediation time ends at a certain hour, and after that, the judge is coming back and either the parties will have to go back to trial, and I'm starting to get anxious about the time. Now I'm feeling like, okay, I need to rush the parties along because something's got to happen in a certain amount of time. If I'm not aware of that, I'm just going to start rushing and I'm not going to be a good mediator. So self-awareness is critical, but then on top of that, I need some self-management. I need to understand how to slow myself down so the choices I make are consistent with what's good for the process, not with my anxiety over time. So I think we're saying the same thing with that. So my focus is actually on the parties, because that actually lessens my anxieties. But my awareness and my management also has to be on me. And that's where the performative stuff and the courage that you mentioned before, that's where that shows up for me. I think we're just saying the same thing in different words.
Yeah, we are very close because for me, during the mediation, there is the element of self-discovery. And sometimes self-awareness is, we are not fully attuned into ourselves because there might be the situations which we were never previously challenged by. And suddenly we realize that there's something that really shakes us up.
Yeah.
That's that element of overcoming I'm really talking about, that first kind of runs through it, realizing, being aware there is something what makes us uncomfortable, and then challenges how we can overcome.
So let me give you a concrete example. So I had a mediation many years ago where I was in private session. I was co-mediating. I was in private session with a party. And she started getting very heated. And in the heat of her anger, and she was just very, very upset. She was crying. She called the other party a money-grubbing Jew. Now, clue, I'm Jewish, all right? So here I am mediating for the parties, but something happened that could potentially have an emotional impact on me, both in what I do in that moment, and then in how I feel and what my story is about this party. So I absolutely had to be self-aware in that moment, and I absolutely had to manage what I did. And what we ended up doing is my co-mediator, who was also Jewish, by the way, we called a mediators caucus, and we just had to debrief with each other what was going on, and to make sure that we could both get to a good place before we continued the mediation. And it was interesting because we both had very different reactions. My co-mediator was so angry. And I actually couldn't help laughing because the situation was ridiculous in my mind. Here she is, cooped up in a tiny little caucus room with two mediators who are Jewish, and she uses that phrase, and the other party wasn't even Jewish, he was Armenian. And just like the whole thing seemed absurd to me, and I couldn't stop laughing. So once I got over my giggles and my co-mediator got over his anger, then we could go back to just saying, okay, she's not a well-educated person. She is used that as a phrase. She doesn't even know the impact of what she means. And we're just going to let it go and continue the mediation. And we did that, and everything was fine. But to get to that point took us some time to go through our emotional reaction. And that's what I mean by the emotional response curve and slowing things down. And you have to make decisions as a mediator to give yourself the space to do that.
I want to definitely give other people the opportunity to get engaged. Just one thing, I had a similar experience, which was slightly different because here it was described to me the mediation where it was a family and divorce mediation, and the mediator was accused of being anti-Semitic.
Mm-hmm.
It was a session, essentially, kind of educational session, which at the time I was running, and she was extremely shook up by that, and that she was driving home, that she just couldn't get rid of that completely obsessive thought of being accused of something she absolutely did not believe. And I was kind of trying to focus her on not only kind of self-reflective element of it, but the letting her kind of work through it. Was it in any way possible? What was it what really made that party to make the statement about her? What it triggered? And I wanted her to focus on it. What it is, what really happened there. That there was that kind of response to her way of mediating. So slightly different, but in a certain way, thematically interesting.
Yeah, well, whatever it is, and there could be lots of different instances of something causing the mediator to have their own strong emotional reaction. And the key is to be aware of it, to slow things down, and to manage it so you can go back to using your craft.
And you're also proposing, Mon, a narrative. right? Back to Moshe's point around narratives, that you're proposing a narrative of courage in facing the discomfort as a virtue. So that then as a mediator, when I'm in that situation, I'm like, oh, this makes you so uncomfortable. If my narrative is that's part of the process and my role now is to courageously move through it, I'll have a different response to that. And so I think that's also a nice sort of interconnection to what Moshe was saying. I want to pass it to Ethan, who I know wanted to jump in.
Yeah, congratulations, Moshe. I hadn't been aware of your book. I haven't read the book. I haven't seen you for 2 years. We live in neighboring towns.
I know, I saw your son though.
Yeah, my son took your class. He liked it a lot. But the pandemic has interfered in numerous ways, some large, some small. This one, what you've been conversing about for the last 45 minutes, I kind of put in this piece of what technology is how technology is affecting our lives. So the broad question is technology affecting mediators' performance?
First of all, there are
But
people.
let me finish.
Sorry, Ethan, go ahead.
The really question is, there was an op-ed piece in the New York Times, I think earlier this week, maybe late last week, by the president of Barnard College. And her point was that for 2 years, we've all been operating under stress. We may not feel it overtly, but it's there and it's affecting our behavior. So the question then is for you, do you sense that?
So 2 very separate questions. Let me answer the second one first. So absolutely. I write a weekly article that I post to my LinkedIn site. My article last week was called Invisible Anxiety. And the idea is we may look okay, we might think we're okay, but there's so much that's not okay, right? I mean, we're driving less, but there's actually more accidents. There's more road rage. There's more, domestic violence. There's more violent crime, right? There are so many signs that we are as a society, as a species, under stress, and that stress is popping out in different ways. And of course, it's going to show up in the mediation room, because when the overall stress is higher, that impacts what the emotional reactions of both parties. And by the way, it impacts you as mediator. So just as a separate little plug, what I did is I started writing these essays the first week we went into lockdown, and I published one every week. And in December, I took the first 61 of these essays, which were the ones I wrote during the lockdown, and I actually published them in a second book called Optimism is a Choice, because that ended up being the title of the first essay. But that more recent essay I wrote called Invisible Anxiety addresses exactly that. What I want to say about technology is that's really not my expertise. I think there's at least a couple of people in this call, you being one of them, who know way more about that than I do. And at the same time, I want to say that technology creates sometimes a buffer between people that, if used right, can help them manage their emotional reactions, but is often not used right. And we've all gotten emails that freaked us out. And we've all have stories we're not so proud of firing back an email in response. So it's not the technology, it's really how we're using it. I mean, because what I do is when I get one of those emails that completely freaks me out, I look at it and I go, ah, and I close it. And then I come back a couple hours later and I open it again, I'm like, ah, and I do that again and again, until one of these times I open it and I go, got this. And that is the point in the emotional response curve from where at which I have gotten to the point where I can be responsive rather than reactive. So it's the same dynamic, but because it's happening electronically, it's happening differently. Now, people negotiate way differently. It's not just email, right, anymore. There's various online platforms. People negotiate by Zoom. People mediate a lot by Zoom. And each one of them creates opportunities, but also creates some challenges. One of the nice things about you can do in Zoom is you can turn your camera off. right? You can turn your audio off, and that gives you a moment where you're not visible and you can let off steam. That's true for you as a mediator. The parties can do that. You can't stop them. Right? So there are things that are helpful about that. But on the other hand, there's things like you don't know who's sitting next to the party. You don't know what notes they're writing them. There's a lot of stuff that you don't control when it's virtual. So yeah, it does affect it, but I'm probably not the most intelligent person in the room to talk about that. You know way more than I do. I know Colin does, and I'm sure other people on the call know more than I do as well.
And Moshe, oh, go ahead, Colin.
Oh, I'm sorry, Justin. I didn't mean to cut you off. Let me just pile on this. I actually love this notion of Collywobbles, and I really feel it in a lot of the online work that I'm doing, because I do think we were just talking about this conference here at Stanford. We were talking about this with the younger generation. I think that anxiety that you described, Moshe, that people feel when they go in. I feel like we're raising a generation of people that prefer the online interaction dynamic for exactly what you say. They can sort of decide, they can do a little bit of, I'm not ready to engage with this now. I want to do this via technology. Lucia, I'm interested in hearing your point about the Zoom mediations that you've done, but I do think there's an element of online disinhibition effect and sort of the cooling distance that happens with technology. And I think it's being normalized. And I think for a lot to negotiate through this channel, because they get less of that heart-beating anxiety when you're sitting across the table from someone, who has a really strong BATNA and who has a lot of power over you. So it's interesting, the degree. I don't know if it's a good thing or it's a bad thing. I just feel like it's something that I want to name in society, that many people are deciding to route their negotiations into technology facilitated communications because they feel like it helps them deal with the very dynamics you're naming in the negotiation process. So Lucia, what did
you want to say anything about that? I'm happy to respond, but Lucia, I was wondering if you wanted to say anything as well.
Oh, just that I see part of the mediator's job as to keep the group oxytocin flowing, to try and create it and keep it going. It's much harder to do that electronically or on Zoom. It's so much more impactful in person. And I just had a lot of experiences last year with people using the screen as a buffer to just behave really badly in ways that I don't think they would have done in person. There are more than two sides to the coin of electronic negotiating and mediating. Please.
So, Isaac Asimov wrote a story many, many years ago about a planet that was very sparsely populated, and people communicated with each other by viewing each other through some sort of screens. And there was a difference in terminology between viewing and seeing. Seeing was in person, viewing was on the screen. And they felt very comfortable viewing, but extremely uncomfortable. It was considered unsanitary to actually be close enough to someone to see them physically. And in a way, I feel like, Colin, what you're saying is we're kind of moving to that. I have 4 kids. My kids are much more comfortable in, communicating with someone via, a text message or an Instagram message than they are having a difficult conversation face to face. And we also know that because texting, for example, is not a content-rich form of media, there's a lot lost in the communication. And and I also see this in companies. So many companies invite me in to say, our people, especially our young people, are spending all of their time negotiating with customers by email, and we need to get them on the phones. We need to get them face to face because there's so much being lost. So yeah, Colin, I think it is the new norm. I think it's more okay than maybe you and I are with it, because they're so used to it, but I think it's less okay than they think it is.
And Lucia raises 2 points, which I think are important, which is one around there's a set of norms around human interaction in person that we've all been raised to expect a certain kind of the way you treat people in person. And because the online media is different, a lot of those norms just vanish. You're just like, you're no longer expecting yourself or others to be held to them. But the other is that discomfort, and I think this connects to what Milan was saying, discomfort and moving through discomfort is often how the transformation happens. You know, Moshe, you were saying the parties are here because they tried it on their own and they weren't able to contain the discomfort that was required in order to move to find some way to collaboratively move forward. And that's part of our job as mediators, is to hold that space. And yet, if we're in a medium that allows us to just turn our camera off when we're uncomfortable or disconnect, how do we as mediators create a space to hold people in the discomfort gently but firmly so they face what they have to face? So I'm interested, Moshe, if you have any thoughts on that as in closing, and then I think we're close to time.
So, you know, I'm sure all of us have, but I can tell you from my personal experience, I've spent the last 2 years on Zoom. I've taught on Zoom, I've coached on Zoom, I've mediated on Zoom. Zoom is a lot of what I do. And I think that even on Zoom, you can do things like maintain eye contact with someone, be more present, take breaks when you need it, but do it in an explicit way. When you have a mediation where, let's say, everybody's being a little bit reserved in joint session, giving the parties opportunities in breakout rooms to have private conversation with you, we can restore some of that intimacy, some of that personal connection. Is it as good as being there? No, but we can approach it by saying, how can we use this tool to create the kind of interpersonal dynamic that we're trying to create and that we would create more naturally if it was in person.
Thank you.
Sharon?
Sharon.
Greetings from snowy Toronto. On a good day, you don't have to go out and shovel snow to get to mediation. A couple of things. Thank you for this. Mediations for the last 2 years, for me, take longer. Everything takes longer. And so I've shifted in how I offer the service. First in the pre-mediation or the private, I take a break every hour. I tell them at 10 to 9, we will take a break. Should you need one before, just put your hand up and we'll take a break, no questions asked. So I go in letting them know that in every hour there's 5 or 10 minutes and they choose which one. And that seems to help. I also insist that they are on camera the entire time, only when we take a break. And to Lucia's point, whether you call it the icebreaker or I call it the insider tip, or especially when I'm doing like multi-parties, 11 parties, I'll say to them, tell me 3 things, or tell everyone 3 things that you do outside of work that you'd like us to know about. So it's very short. I skate, I cook, I kite, you know, whatever. After that, then I go into the ground rules and whatever else. But I also tell them at the beginning to be transparent. This is an artificial meeting on Zoom. So to build hospitality and to help people to relax, I'm going to start with a question and I'm going to go first. And so once I do that, and I've been doing that the entire time, no one ever says no. They all comply because transparently I've told them why. It's also because I've used the information from the private session where some people are nervous or whatever else. I am trying to ensure that they go last. It doesn't always work, but that I call the private session or the pre-mediation session a harvest. That's where I gather most things I need or I need to be aware of to play out. But it takes more time. I have to build in that facility. And to Lucia's point about an icebreaker, whatever, however you call it, it does work, but I actually tell them why I'm doing it. And that seems, especially if I've got a power imbalance, a chairman of a board and a staff member, you know, in a multi-party, it just works. And as Lucia said, I go first. As to your point, I just want to go back for a second, because what I do when I hear something that is, we have slightly different laws in Ontario for human rights, like we need to ask about legal accommodation and about a support person. You can't start a mediation unless you have those things in place. It's illegal. No one wants a support person anymore because they're all doing it in their office or their home, but they do want a legal accommodation. And some of the legal accommodations have shifted. In the past, it used to be, I need a special chair or an elevator, or I need a translator. Some of the more interesting ones I've had is a new mom saying, I need a legal accommodation at these 2 times because I'm breastfeeding. and I will be off camera. So I get all of that in the pre-mediation meeting, and then I just announce it at the beginning. And I don't say the party. I say, one of you is going to be off camera. I have granted the legal accommodation, and it is going to be for 10 minutes. They will be listening, they'll be part of it, but they'll be off camera. Mm-hmm. And so I share this with you because she did it twice and it worked super. And on the third time, which was the last time, a very powerful, privileged stakeholder who made references like, when my limo pulls up to take me to my airport on my jet, like that kind of person, said, how do I know she's listening? I said, because I can see on chat whose camera's off and on, and she is listening and she's part of this. The mother came on and said, I'm breastfeeding, and that's what it is. She didn't have to tell you. She didn't tell you, do you want me to do this on camera? And that was it. She just shut it down and she stopped right away. Because I never disclose what the legal accommodation is. I just grant it and say to them, it will be granted, and be prepared. But the work going in pre-mediation takes more time. The mediation takes more time. And the last piece I'll leave you with is when you talk about feeling anxious or something landing on you, I reframe it. I take that piece and I reframe it. I make it land gentler and softer, but I'll call out like the piece that you talked about, someone money grabbing. I'll say, I'm just going to pause. Did I hear correctly that you selected a certain religion and you put a certain category out? Could you speak to that? Because it is astounding to hear that. Where did that come from? And by reframing it, I call it out and they stop it because it's illegal to do that. First of all, so it's my job to stop it here under human rights. But I use the reframe when people come, whether they come after me or they come after someone else. And the reframe seems to work. And my key for reframing is I take that ticking bomb and I make it land kinder and gentler. But I don't ignore the ticking bomb. I call it out right away. Thank you all for sharing.
So I'm aware of time. Just one quick response to that I agree with you. Reframing is a wonderful tool. It's my favorite tool. And at the same time, you can only reframe if you yourself aren't knocked off balance and freaking out. And that's where managing your emotions to be able to do that. Now, you're an experienced mediator. You don't get knocked off balance frequently. But the challenge is when it does happen, to be aware of it, catch yourself, slow things down, and then for you yourself to respond rather than react. So you can use tools like reframing as effectively as you normally would.
One of the things I think we all agree about, we haven't said, and it doesn't come in a formulaic way, slowing down the conversation is a tool. Mm-hmm. Pausing, and I actually use pause a lot, and I say it's a tool, and I say, I'm just going to pause. Let me just listen to myself. Did you just say, or did I just hear? But I pause, and I pause for 10 seconds. When I'm in
that's great.
I stand up, and I stand up in the boardroom.
Yeah, it makes me think of like thinking fast and slow. A lot of what we do as mediators is we're trying to get people to think slow. So I do want to, I'm cognizant of time, and Sharon, thank you so much for that. First of all, Justin, thank you. Excellent job. You're a wonderful host. Please, I appreciate you stepping up. If you ever want to be a host again, please let me know. You're a master. But Moshe, thanks, thank you. I feel like some of the connections between negotiation and mediation, we don't talk about this enough. This was a fascinating session, and thank you for your great work, and thank you for sharing all your thoughts today. We could easily go on another hour, as you can see, but do you want to make a final comment about your book?
Well, first of all, I wanted to show the book because a lot of people haven't seen it. So this is what it looks like.
It's great. I love that cover.
And the idea with the butterflies is kind of butterflies in your stomach because that's what people feel. And thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for inviting me for the great conversation and discussion. And, my email is moshe@negotiatingtable.com. If anybody wants to continue the conversation at any time, just pop me an email. Happy to continue the conversation. It was a pleasure meeting all of you. Colin, thank you so much for inviting me. And Justin, thank you so much for the help.
You bet. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for taking the time. Enjoy the weekend. Stay warm, stay healthy, and we'll talk again soon.
Talk soon. Thank you.